Have you ever gone through something awful that then you realized later God was actually protecting you from something worse? Hey everybody, this is Pastor Justin Walker here with The Whole Truth, and I'd like to have a conversation with you. Leave it down in the comments below. Have you ever just gone through something awful, but then realized that God was actually working something else out in your life or protecting you from something else? We're going through the entire Bible here, from Genesis all the way to Revelation. I'm on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook every weekday morning with a new video going straight through the Bible, seeing what God has for us each and every day. And so in Genesis chapter 46, we pick up with this story of Jacob. And he had a son named Joseph, who Joseph's brothers, Jacob's other sons, had sold into slavery. And so 22 years later, Jacob finds out that his favored son Joseph is alive and in power. And Joseph has invited his father Jacob to come there with him and live with him in Egypt. And so Jacob is going to pack up and go to Egypt. But there's a problem with that. I'll get to that in just a moment. Let's read the first part of the chapter. Genesis 46, start in verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. By the way, if you're confused, Jacob and Israel, same guy, just a different name. Okay, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. So he says, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here am I. And in verse 3, so he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down into Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Wow, God speaks to Jacob in a dream. Jacob comes to Beersheba. That's where Isaac and Abraham had both made sacrifices to God. And God had spoke to them in Beersheba. And so here Jacob goes to Beersheba. He sees where Beersheba is, and you can just imagine as the carts are pulling up, they loaded up all those carts. By the way, carts back then would have been the equivalent of you getting on a private jet. Okay, to get in the carts, the Egyptian carts, and to be brought into Egypt. What a blessing. And so Jacob is going to load up the carts. He's planning on going down into Egypt. They come to Beersheba, and Jacob, you can just imagine Jacob saying, stop the carts, stop the carts. And he goes to worship, and he makes a sacrifice to the Lord there. He goes to sleep that night, and in a dream, God calls to him, Jacob, Jacob. And Jacob says, here am I. And God says, I am the God of your father, Isaac. Don't be scared to go down into Egypt. Why would Jacob be scared? How does that make any sense? Why would Jacob be scared? He's in the carts. There's the blessings. Well, I'll tell you why. Because back in Genesis chapter 15, God had told Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. Remember, Abraham, Father Abraham, had many sons. That guy, Abraham. Okay, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So this is Jacob that we're talking about today. It's his grandfather, Abraham. God told his grandfather, Abraham, that one day the nation, his nation that was coming through him, was going to be ruled by another people. They were going to be treated harshly. They were going to be enslaved and ruled by another people. And here we are getting to the end of Jacob's life. And Jacob is getting ready to head into Egypt. You can imagine the fear that would have probably been inside of him to think, am I leading my family directly into slavery, into a life of slavery? And here's the scary part. The answer is yes. Jacob was being told to go to Egypt. There's no food. God has orchestrated this whole thing. There's a famine in the land. There's no food. They have to go to Egypt to get the food. And now they've been invited to go live in Egypt where there is food and where there is prosperity and where things are going well. And they're being told they'll be taken care of. But in the back of Jacob's mind, he remembers his grandfather's stories that they would be ruled by another people, that they would be enslaved to the Egyptians. I can imagine how that must feel to think, what am I supposed to do? And God speaks to Jacob and says, don't be afraid to go down into Egypt. And then God says this. Read this in verse 3. God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down into Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. God is going to make him a great nation in Egypt. And look, he says this, and he says, I will go, in verse 4, I will go down with you into Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Joseph, your favored son, when you pass, Joseph will be there, and he will put his hand on your eyes. Take comfort, Jacob. This is in my plan. I'm going to make you a great nation while you're there in Egypt. Now, we don't usually think about the Egyptian slavery of the Hebrews that way. It was an awful thing that they went through. But yet, in the middle of that awful thing they were going through, God was also doing something. He was building them into a great nation. It's been pointed out here recently that maybe one of the things God was doing was protecting Israel from the Canaanites. You see, the Egyptians, as we'll see later in the chapter, the Egyptians were a very segregated people. And they did not like to intermingle. So if you were Egyptian, they wanted to keep that pure. They wanted to keep that line pure. They didn't want anybody else to mingle with that line. The Canaanites didn't seem to have that rule. Remember that even Judah took a Canaanite wife. Judah is one of the sons of Jacob. And even Judah took a Canaanite wife. And so it is almost as if God is sheltering Israel in Egypt so that they don't basically blend their entire line with all of the Canaanite people, and all the Canaanite people become Israelite people. God was protecting the Israelite nation so they could grow into a great nation, but he needed a kind of an incubation place. And so for the next 400 years, they're going to be enslaved in Egypt. And that's a hard thing. Let me tell you a little story today as we close out. I own a business. Many of you know that I own a business in town, and we were renting a place. And we were just outgrowing it. It became too small. The whole business, the entire business, was smaller than my house. Okay, so the business was growing, and my store and my shop combined was smaller than my house. We needed a place to grow, and there was a building that was about double the square footage, and it came up for sale. And so we went in to look at that building, and we loved it. We thought it was great. And so we wanted to buy that building, and we went and talked to the owner, and he was even willing to own or finance that building to us with no down payment, to just basically, like if we were renting to own, we were going to pay him money every month, and it was all going to go to the principal, and he'd make all the money off of it and get a nice little monthly income, and it seemed like everything was going to work out perfect. And so we were all excited, and we're getting ready to move. And then all of a sudden he gets this realtor involved, and this realtor talks this guy out of our deal and says that, oh, you ought to make them get a loan, go to the bank and get a loan, and then, you'll get all your money up front. And the guy said, well, I've already made the deal with him. So the realtor ends up talking this guy into a balloon note. He says, here's what I'll do. I'll sell you the building, but you have to have it paid off in the next 5 years. Well, that was going to make our monthly payment at the end of that 5 years like $15,000 or $20,000 a month. We couldn't afford it. And so we were devastated. We couldn't get the building, and we had to stay in the building we were in. We were busting at the seams, and there were times we couldn't buy products because we didn't have enough space to store those products or any place to sell those products. And it just seemed like a really awful situation. And we thought, why? And then they ended up selling the building to some whatever knickknack store. We were so mad. We were like, why? Why would you do that and not sell us the building? We had such a great deal going. Well, a couple of years goes by, and we were still pretty annoyed that we didn't get that building and that we were stuck in this building where we were. And things were tough there. They were tight there. And we were trying to move, but things were just tough. And we were just passing that building every day. And one day I'm passing up that building, and there's a bunch of official vehicles outside. And I know some people in the county, and they informed me that there were actually tanks, old gas tanks in the ground. And the people that were there were the EPA. And it was going to cost them like hundreds of thousands of dollars to get those tanks dug out of the ground. If I had bought that building, that hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, that digging the tanks out of the ground, that would have fallen on me. But I didn't know that at the time. I was just upset that I didn't get the building that I wanted. Now, I know that there are probably worse situations that we could think of, and I'm not comparing me not being able to buy a building to Egyptian slavery. But what I am saying to you is, what is God protecting you from? We look at these circumstances in our life, and we think to ourselves, well, if God would just let me, or if God would just give us, or if God would just do, or if we could just whatever, then things would be better. But sometimes that's not the case. Who knows what would have happened to Israel if Israel had stayed in Canaan? God was going to make them into a great nation, but he needed them to be in Egypt. And yeah, that meant a hard road ahead. There were some hard things ahead of them, but what God was doing was working things out for the best to make them into the great nation that he needed Israel to be. So what might God be doing in your life, even though things might be hard right now? All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow with more of Genesis chapter 46. See you then.